Dr. Mary Hunter is a visiting research fellow at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research, researching decolonization in UK-Pakistan relations.
What was Pakistan supposed to be? The original vision of Jinnah? What role did Zia play in changing Pakistan's narrative?
People sometimes take for granted that Jinnah had this very definitive vision for Pakistan. But obviously, when you look at the 1947 speech, the narratives that Liaquat Ali Khan used when he was introducing the Objectives Resolution, for me, are more aligned with what figures like Maududi and Zia. He felt that the ulama were kind of detached from reality.
Did you face any challenges being here, trying to research more on, say, Zia?
So the topics related to Zia and religious minorities were obviously for my PhD. So what I'm working on here is a completely different topic, which is decolonization.
How much did the Afghan, change or the wars impact Pakistan's Islamization?
People generally say that Zia used Islamization in order to kind of support the fact that they were giving covert assistance to the Mujahideen.
This was a deep-seated belief that Zia had that we needed to create a Muslim ummah.
And they say that Zia merely used Islam and Islamization in order to legitimize his undemocratic rule.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to another episode of How Does It Work, a podcast by Pro-Pakistani. I am very, very excited for our guest today, Dr. Mary Hunter. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Assalamu alaikum, ye dawat ke liye aapka bahut shukriya.
So the rest of this is going to be in Urdu, or is that all?
Let's take it.
Okay, so first, let's start with what are you doing in Islamabad and why are you studying Zia and other parts of our history?
Yeah, so I'm currently 4 months into my 6-month fellowship with the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research. So I'm a visiting research fellow working on decolonization in UK-Pakistan relations. And I chose to come to kind of improve my expertise of Pakistan more holistically outside of my PhD. So I graduated back in June, and as you say, that was on Zia's Islamization and focused on the consequences of that for religious minorities. I just kind of chose to do it as part of my PhD and kind of fell in love with the country, and I found it so fascinating that I kind of wanted to come and get to know Pakistan and Pakistanis better. So.
And while you've been living here, how have you found Pakistan? So you were telling me off air as well that you're living just normal life, took a cab here, everything is. So how have you found it, considering you started studying about, Islamic fundamentalism and obviously Pakistan came up?
Yeah, so I guess part of the reason why I chose the topic for my undergraduate dissertation was to look at those kind of mischaracterizations of Muslims, and then later on it's grown into looking at the kind of discrimination against Pakistanis and Muslims more generally, especially in the UK. And so obviously I was conscious of those prejudices and stereotypes, but I knew that that's what they were. So I came here, tried to come here with an open mind. Obviously I'm conscious of the security situation, and the situation for women as well more generally. But I've never had any issues in Pakistan, and as you say, I feel comfortable moving around. So it's a case of being sensible and not putting yourself at risk, but also, making the most of being in a different country and trying new things and meeting new people. So.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but your mother she was in the British Army.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And what did she do in the British Army?
So she was a lieutenant colonel. She unfortunately passed away in March 2021 from cancer. But she was an educationalist, so she spent most of her career trying to improve education and literacy for British Army soldiers and officers. One of the key things that she did was creating this degree program whereby officers could undertake a master's at the same time as doing their full-time job as an army officer. So for me, she was very much that kind of first role model with that emphasis on education and open-mindedness. And she actually did a PhD as well. So the last 7 or 8 years of her life, she was working part-time on a PhD. So she managed to do the Viva before she passed away, but not finish the corrections. So for me, she had acknowledged us in our PhD, and I kind of wanted to do the same in mine. So she's continues to be an inspiration, and every positive I see within myself is because of her. So yeah.
That's great. And before I get to the actual crux of what you've sort of learned so far, did you face any challenges being here, trying to research more on, say, Zia or the topics that you have sort of in mind?
So the topics related to Zia and religious minorities were obviously for my PhD. So what I'm working on here is a completely different topic, which is decolonization. So with decolonization, most people tend to be of the opinion that obviously colonialism was bad, which I agree with. But at the same time, you'll meet some people who are quite nostalgic towards the British colonialists. So in terms of decolonization, I wouldn't say I've faced issues. But whenever I'm talking about my PhD, aware of the fact that they're quite controversial topics, I just try and approach it sensitively and respectfully because I'm conscious that people might get upset about some of the topics that we're discussing. So I think it's a case of not compromising on my beliefs, but also being respectful at the same time.
Right. And in terms of your beliefs, what have you learned? So let's say if I ask you what, from your understanding and learning in your PhD, what was Pakistan supposed to be? Is it the original vision of Jinnah? What role did Zia play in changing Pakistan's narrative? Walk us through what you've sort of learned so far.
Yeah, so I think this is a really central issue and one that's very complicated because I think people sometimes take for granted that Jinnah had this very definitive vision for Pakistan. So you have some scholars who say, yes, he always had this definitive vision and he envisaged a secular Pakistan. And then you have other scholars who suggest, well, actually, he didn't have a definitive vision and that was deliberate in order to unite a very diverse Indian Muslim community. I'm slightly more inclined to the latter, but obviously when you look at the 1947 speech to the Constituent Assembly, that was unequivocally in favour of a secular state. So if you take that in mind, after Pakistan's been created, then yes, Jinnah envisioned a secular state. And for me, the turning point then towards the more Islamic identity of Pakistan was the Objectives Resolution in 1949, which was the first kind of statement about what the constitution should be based on in terms of the principles. And that was under Liaquat Ali Khan as the first prime minister. And that unequivocally stated that sovereignty in Pakistan would belong to God and that elected representatives would only have a kind of limited role to play. And it also created this kind of hierarchy between Muslims and non-Muslims, where Muslims would be enabled to live according to Islamic teachings, whereas religious minorities would only have this very vague, adequate provision to profess and practice their religion. So for me, that represented the turning point away from that secular vision from 1947 to a more Islamic identity. And the narratives that Liaquat Ali Khan used when he was introducing the Objectives Resolution, for me, are more aligned with what figures like Maududi and Zia said. So he believed that Pakistan was created in order for Muslims to live according to Islamic teachings, which, in my opinion, Jinnah didn't say that. And Liaquat Ali Khan also suggested that Muslims wanted to show the world that Islam offered this panacea to all of, modern day issues. And that is a similar language to what Maududi and Zia would use as part of the Islamization process. So I think that's kind of the key formative moment early on in Pakistan's history.
And do you think one of the reasons that a lot of the times we sort of go back to this Islamic belief system is just because we have to also justify a reason for the existence of Pakistan, right? So we were part of a larger subcontinent and we wanted a state for Muslims. If it's a state for Muslims, there has to be some sort of Islamic ability to it. Now, a lot of people, the liberals, for example, and they don't understand because that's not what Jinnah wanted. But is that one of the reasons that this has been a key underlying theme from the beginning of Pakistan? And then how much of this is related to what was going on the other side of the border? What I mean by that is Afghanistan and the Soviet war, which was strongly obviously backed by the United States at the time, and then the creation of Islam as a weapon against the Soviets, and then obviously the war on terror. So how much did the Afghan change or the wars impact Pakistan's Islamization?
So I think when it comes to the vision for Pakistan, obviously some of the Muslim League and Jinnah, I think, were more concerned with communal interest in terms of safeguarding the political rights of Indian Muslims. And they were worried that if this new independent India had this Hindu majority, that they wouldn't have the rights to which they deserved. So for me, he wasn't necessarily theologically inspired. He didn't have that Islamist intent in terms of establishing an Islamic state in Pakistan. And then you have figures like Maududi, who believed that actually, unless Pakistan was based on God's sovereignty and there was Islamic law, then it would be Na Pakistan, or land of the impure. So you have that division then between people who were in the Pakistan movement and had more that communal interest, and then others outside of that who were inclined towards an Islamic state. So my suggestion then is that actually it's difficult to say exactly what, Pakistan's kind of identity was in that sense. I don't think you can equivocally say that it was meant for people to be more Islamic, in my opinion. And that's why I say that Liaquat Ali Khan and the Objectives Resolution was a turning point in that respect. I think when it comes to the Soviet-Afghan War from 79 to 89, people generally say that Zia used Islamization in order to kind of support the fact that they were giving covert assistance to the Mujahideen.
Yeah.
So as you say, that would then support their kind of intent of resisting the Soviets who are coming into Afghanistan. And of course, then that links to the issue of funding from the US, that if Pakistan was closely associated with America, then it would get more financial aid. And of course, under the Reagan administration, that was the case. And that was under the guise of Pakistan having more self-defense because of the Soviet invasion. So some people argue that was the case. Others suggest, obviously, after the revolution in Iran, that there was that competition between Saudi and Iranian influence in Pakistan, which exacerbated sectarian tensions. So these are all, I think, very important factors. But of course, because I was looking more at Pakistan and Islamization through this domestic
lens.
Exactly, through kind of coloniality and theological influences, I took a slightly different approach. So I do think they're relevant, but that wasn't the central focus of
Okay, what was the central focus?
So I was arguing that we have to kind of contextualize Zia's Islamization process within Maududi's theological thoughts and also within British colonial
Okay,
thought
tell
and
me a bit about
practice.
Maududi's, first tell me about him and then what made the thought process interesting.
Yeah, so Maududi, I would suggest for anyone who's interested, Syed Vali Nazar wrote 2 very good books, one of them specifically on Maududi and the second one on the Jamaat-e-Islami. So if people are interested to know in detail about those 2 things, they should read his books. But effectively, Maududi was born in 1903 in pre-partition India. And he had a traditional religious education, so I believe by Deobandi ulama. But he kind of had an understanding of Western education as well. And he felt that the ulama were kind of detached from reality. And he wanted to have that more nuanced understanding of the world by approaching it in terms of Islamic education, but being aware of the realities of the situation. And he first started off as a journalist. So he was a newspaper editor. And he was heavily involved in anti-colonial activities such as the Khilafat movement. So then it was only in 1941 when he founded the Jamaat-e-Islami, which was regarded as a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami as a counter-league. So it was an alternative to the Muslim League. And as mentioned, Maududi didn't kind of agree with the Pakistan movement because for him, Muslim nationalism didn't make sense in Islam, because it has that emphasis on kind of rising above race, caste, and creed. And originally, the Jamaat-e-Islami was focused on improving the religiosity of the people within it. And it was only after Pakistan's independence that it then contested elections for the first time. So that's kind of the background of Maududi prior to partition. Yeah.
And what exactly did Zia sort of see? And before I even get to that, do you think how much of this was Zia seeing this as a means to an end? I understand he was a deeply religious man.
Yeah.
But was this also a power play? He sees opportunity to gain more power. He sees opportunity to gain more funding from the US. So he uses, certain theology or whatever to get there. Or is it a question of this was a deep-seated belief that Zia had that we needed to create a Muslim ummah?
Yeah, so this is kind of the most central argument that most scholars make when they're working on Islamization. They say that Zia merely used Islam and Islamization in order to legitimize his undemocratic rule, because obviously he came to power through a bloodless coup in July 1977 by overthrowing the Bhutto government. For me, obviously this is problematized by the fact, as you say, that he was a deeply religious man. So if you look at what his supporters in the military, but also his opponents said, they were all agreed that he was a deeply religious man. So I think it was Bhutto even said that they'd chosen a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami as to be the chief of army staff. So both sides kind of agree that he was a deeply religious man. And before he became president, he used to distribute Jamaat-e-Islami literature as part of awards to officers within the military. And he also changed the motto to be kind of more religiously inclined as well. So for me, it's difficult to say that he merely used religion because of the fact that he was so deeply religious. Some people also say that he was colonial in the sense that he knew that the people were inherently religious. So then he knew that he could use it to those ends. But for me, I argue more that he felt he knew what was right for the people of Pakistan. So he actually suggested that the people of Pakistan were not religious enough. He was saying that young Muslims were turning away from Islam because the older Muslims were hypocrites, because they weren't actually living according to what they were saying. So for me, he had more of a paternalistic approach to it, such that he felt that he knew what was right, the right way to live by in Pakistan, and he used kind of authoritarian means in order to ensure that was the case. I'd say that there are instances where he used the Islamic ideology to preserve his undemocratic rule. But at the end of the day, for me, it's difficult to say conclusively that he merely used religion.
Was the loss of East Pakistan a factor? From what I understand, what is now Bangladesh were the more liberal part of Pakistan. When East and West were together, they were the more industrial focused, more business focused, more liberal. Do you think the loss of East Pakistan in 1971 was a contributing factor to a lot of this?
Yes, I think so, because obviously part of the issue was the fact that Bengali nationalism started as soon as kind of Pakistan was created. So you have that emphasis on Bengali culture and language. But the problem was that then again, if you look back to the Objectives Resolution, Liaquat Ali Khan was saying, well, it's good that we have this diversity and it makes our country more rich. But if anything weakens national unity, then we're not going to tolerate it effectively. So this attempt to kind of have identities within the country that didn't unify the entire country was seen as a threat. So I think Bengali nationalism in that sense was seen as a threat by some. And also it was the fact that Islam there was kind of more syncretic. So it had more of the influence of Hinduism, which then again, if you look at revivalist movements in the late 19th century in Islam, they were wanting to rid Islam of these kind of Hindu influences and customary influences. So I think these are relevant matters. And then, of course, when East Pakistan Bangladesh became independent, the problem was then that Pakistan could no longer say, numerically speaking, we are the homeland of South Asian Muslims. So East Pakistan actually had a larger population than West Pakistan. And then after the loss of East Pakistan, there were almost as many Muslims in India as there were in Pakistan.
Right.
So then it couldn't say, well, we are numerically the home of South Asian Muslims. So scholars like Ijaz Ahmad and Fazana Sheikh have suggested that after the loss of East Pakistan, it had to become the homeland of the good Muslims. So then there was more of an emphasis on being more Islamic. And Fazana Sheikh also suggested that after the loss of East Pakistan, then Pakistan became more homogenous. There were more Muslims, more minorities had been lost because they were in East Pakistan. So then there was more of a justification for the Islamization process after that.
And in terms of, you mentioned Zia's conversations of being a good Muslim or creating an economy or a people that were good Muslims. In an ideal world, what was he hoping that would look like?
I think you can look at kind of the earliest things that he did as part of Islamization. So some of them were the creation of the Federal Shariat Court in 1980, the introduction of the Hudud Ordinances in 1979. So these were all obviously concerned with bringing the laws into conformity with Islamic injunctions and making sure that new laws were also in line with Islamic teachings. And he wanted people to live according to Islamic law. So, of course, the Hudud Ordinances is to do with sexual relations, theft, prohibition, that sort of thing. So he wanted, this is why then it's difficult sometimes to define Islamization as the top-down process or the bottom-up process. So Islamization under Zia was primarily a top-down process in the sense that he made legal changes in order to try and change the way people were behaving. Whereas others would say you'd have to have a bottom-up process where the people change and then you change society after that. But he kind of had advocated both at different times. So he said that we both had to make these changes from the top, but he also expected people to become more religious. So you've then also got examples like the Ramadan ordinance, which then said that people had to close down their shops and cinemas and things would be closed during Ramadan. So he was trying to encourage people to take it upon themselves to be more religious, but he was also enforcing people to become more religious through the legal reforms that he was making.
And did it work? I'm assuming it did make people more religious. Did it not?
Well, I guess because of the fact that it was an authoritarian rule as well, you would be less inclined to, go against those things, wouldn't you, out of fear? And you've obviously got the referendum in 1984. And some scholars have suggested this was the means by which Zia could say, well, I've got the mandate of the people now, because I think it was something like 94% of people voted in favor of him continuing the Islamization process. So in that, he kind of equated Islamization with the basis upon which Pakistan was created. But of course, it was effectively like 4 questions in one, so it wasn't a very transparent referendum. And again, out of fear of
what were
the
those
regime.
questions?
I'd have to look it up again, but the central one that I focused on was the fact that it associated the creation of Pakistan with this Islamic ideology. And then obviously that issue is, well, what is this Islamic ideology? So obviously a lot of changes were made and they're still in place today. So then you could argue, well, did political leaders after that, as critical as they were, did they want to change it, or did they feel that actually mainstream society believed in these changes?
That's what I was going to ask next. So once all of this happens, why didn't someone? Well, to an extent, the next sort of dictator in Musharraf was a very liberal man, and he had enlightened moderation. Have the people of Pakistan, in your opinion, completely bought into Zia's vision for Pakistan? And is it very hard to sort of reverse it now?
I think support for Zia is very much based on class. So obviously mainstream society, working and lower middle classes tend to be more religious, generally speaking, whereas the elite are the more liberal in society. So it depends who you speak to. My personal experience is that most young professionals and the generation of what my parents would be were very negative about Zia. But then I've also met people who said, well, he was the man that we needed at the time with regards to the Soviet invasion, and that they actually believed in the changes that he made. And the first time I came to Pakistan, interestingly, I was at Faisal Masjid, where his mazar is in the grounds. And I went in there and I was watching people, and they would take their shoes off to go inside, and they would offer prayer, and then some people would take pictures of their children alongside his tombstone, effectively. So you can clearly see that aspects of society do believe in the changes that he made. So I don't think you can concretely say that all of Pakistan dislike him or all of Pakistan
like him.
Yeah, exactly. I think it depends on class and each person's personal religious beliefs.
And a little while earlier, we were discussing Iran and Saudi, and maybe that being a factor in, sects, the Sunni Shia debate. There was also in Zia's era certain issues with a particular part of Pakistan, the Ahmadiyyas. Can you walk me through that a little bit, the history of it and the significance of it?
Yeah. So again, for anyone who's interested, I'd recommend Sadia Saeed's book, Politics of Desecularization, and Ali Usman Kazmi also wrote a very good book about the Ahmadiyya community. So Sadia Saeed talks about the whole kind of development of the community. And effectively it was created in the 1880s under Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And he had an unorthodox interpretation of Khatami Nabuwat, or finality of prophethood. So he suggested that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, believed that actually he was the seal, so that he could say that, well, someone else coming later, they are a prophet as well. He could confirm a prophethood. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad initially didn't say he was a prophet, but later on he did say that. He said that he wasn't a law-bearing prophet, so he wasn't bringing a new Quran or anything like that, but that he was a prophet. So of course, for members of the ulama especially, that upset them a great deal. So Sadia Saeed talks about how the first fatwa against the Ahmadiyya community was actually issued as early as the 1890s. And the ulama, as much as they disagreed on different topics, they often united against the Ahmadiyya community. So that kind of goes to show how much of a sore point it was for them. And you see different groups, especially Majlis CRR, before partition as well, were very strongly anti-Ahmadi. Figures like Muhammad Iqbal as well. And then after partition, before partition, the community split in 1914. So you've got the so-called Qadianis on the one hand and the Lahoris on the other. The Lahoris believe that he wasn't a prophet. Their founder wasn't a prophet. So generally they're...
So are they Ahmadis as well?
They are technically, yeah, but they call themselves Lahoris.
Okay.
So they're two different aspects of the community. So obviously they're generally more acceptable on a theological level because they don't suggest that Mirza was a prophet. Whereas then the so-called Qadianis or Ahmadis as well, they do. So they're more controversial in the eyes of the ulama. And Sadia Saeed talks about three kind of key moments in the history of Pakistan when it comes to the Ahmadiyya community. The first is the moment of accommodation, which is in 1953 to 54, where you have the first anti-Ahmadi riots. And this was sparked by the ulama saying that constitutionally we should declare Ahmadis non-Muslims. But the Court of Inquiry disregarded that and said, well, you members of the ulama can't agree on a definition of a Muslim, so how can you say that they are non-Muslims? And then the second moment was the moment of exclusion. So that was the Second Amendment under Bhutto in 1974, which amended the constitution to say that Ahmadis were non-Muslims. And it defines non-Muslim as a lack of belief in the finality of prophethood.
Wait, I have a question. Are Ahmadis considered non-Muslims in any other Muslim countries? Are they sort of, do they have, they are in other parts of the world, right?
I think they are still persecuted for their beliefs even in non-Muslim countries by the standards of other Muslims in those countries. So even in places like the UK and the US, other Muslims will not necessarily accept them. That's the understanding I have.
And are they allowed to, for example, go to Saudi or places like that to do pilgrimage?
I think that's an issue. I don't know exactly the details, but
right.
Yeah, I'm sure that's probably problematic.
And why was Bhutto, why did he decide to change their sort of, religion or whatever? So
this is a difficult question. So what happened was initially the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Islami Jamaat-e-Talaba, they were engaged in these fights with members of the Ahmadiyya community. So apparently the Ahmadis came onto a train that the IJT were distributing Ahmadi literature, and that then caused a fight. And then this fight turned into countrywide riots. So it was the second time that we had these mass-scale riots against the Ahmadiyya community. So people then suggest that actually Bhutto was accused of being an Ahmadi or of being loyal to the Ahmadis. So I think he then said, well, we'll debate this issue in Parliament as a concession to the anti-Ahmadi kind of lobby effectively. So I think he gave in to the pressure. And then after this, you can read the full report, and it's like thousands of pages long. Of the Parliament would have legal, I think it was the Attorney General was the one in charge, and he would bring in Ahmadis, the leaders, to talk about their religion. And then this eventually led to the Second Amendment, which a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami, Professor Ghaffur Ahmad, was one of the members of the committee who chose the wording of the Second Amendment. And this, as I say, constitutionally declared them to be non-Muslim. So this, for most people, they would say that Bhutto just gave in to the pressure to...
Does being non-Muslim legally make any difference being a citizen here in Pakistan?
So this is why then the Zia regime said that the criminalization was necessary, because they felt that the Second Amendment didn't actually change anything because, yes, constitutionally speaking, they were declared non-Muslims, but it wasn't affecting the way they were behaving or the way that they affiliated with the Muslim community. So that's why the criminalization of the community was actually more important in terms of the day-to-day effects on the people.
What do you mean when you say criminalization?
So in 1984, there were two amendments to the Penal Code, offences relating to religion, 298B and 298C. And these stated that Ahmadis would be criminalised, or they would be either imprisoned or fined if they used Islamic epithets. So, for example, using the azan, calling it the azan, calling their place of worship a masjid, using the kind of titles for members of their own community that are usually used for either the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or his companions. And the second then criminalised Ahmadis for posing as Muslims, which is quite a vague. It said if you indirectly or directly pose as a Muslim. So then...
How does one pose as a Muslim?
So this has led to many different kind of interpretations of that law that aren't explicitly the case. But the idea was that them calling themselves Muslim was then criminalised. So if they said... I'm a Muslim, or maybe if they use the like Assalamu alaikum as a greeting, things like that. And obviously now it's been more widely interpreted to prevent them from using minarets on their masjid, or their places of worship, because that's considered an Islamic motif. And
they can still have places of worship though.
They can, but as long as they don't call them a masjid and they don't use things that are considered to be Islamic, like minarets. That's why you see often minarets being removed. So there's been the attempt to prevent them from engaging in activities as well that are considered Islamic, such as Qurbani at the time of Eid. So there's a lot of different ways that it's kind of manifested over the years.
And in the years that have sort of followed, we were talking about this offer as well, they seem to be a very prosperous community financially. Was that a factor in sort of Zia and other people's? Did they have power in terms of financial or otherwise? Was that an issue?
So this is what Ali Usman Kazmi talks about. He said that actually at partition, the Ahmadiyya community did quite well out of partition. So at that time, it forced people to migrate from different parts of Punjab, for example, from east to west or vice versa. So some people who were forced to move then lost out on their property and they had to start again. And some people were able to gain property or good land and access to particular jobs like within the bureaucracy and the government. So he talks about how they were more disproportionately involved in government and having better land. So some people would say that animosity was created by the economic situation as well, that it was a class problem. And of course, the first foreign minister of Pakistan was Zia-ul-Haq Khan, who was an Ahmadi, who used to attend kind of Ahmadiyya events. And he got a lot of hate from elements of society because of his Ahmadi faith, even though kind of Jinnah himself never kind of said that he was a non-Muslim and never, said that he had to leave the Muslim League. So, so it is definitely a relevant factor when it came to partition primarily. I didn't see as much about that later, but perhaps it's a factor as well. So.
Okay. And just one sort of last area I wanted to touch with you. In your undergraduate degree, you studied something related to religious studies, right?
Yes, theology, yeah.
Yeah. And then you studied with your PhD in relation to Islamization.
Yeah.
you have a pretty good idea of Islam and Muslims now. How do you find the religion, and how much of it is misinterpreted and used for some sort of gain? How much of it is lost in different sects? What do you make of all of it?
Yeah, so as you say, for my undergraduate dissertation, I wrote about the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, and it was partly to kind of respond to the mischaracterization of Muslims as terrorists and as violent. And obviously my suggestion in that was that if you look at what the Quran says, the actions that people like the TTP take are completely un-Islamic. Like, you can't justify the killing of innocent people for political ends as part of the Quran. So for me, it's important to look back to what it says in order to reflect on what it stands for. And I was quite fortunate to have very open-minded parents. We used to travel a lot. We went to Muslim countries. We used to visit masjids. We would listen and talk to people, and we knew a lot of Muslims growing up. So we always had that more open-minded approach. And so then you have a more nuanced understanding of the religion than other people who don't know any Muslims and don't know about Islam. But I do feel a natural affinity towards Islam. And I think if you're one of the three Abrahamic faiths, Jews, Christians, or Muslims, your religion is very similar. So if you belong to one of the faiths, it would be really difficult for you to say that you don't agree with one of the others, except for maybe some theological issues. But for me, I read the whole Quran during Ramadan 2 years ago, and I found it absolutely fascinating as someone who studied religion to see the comparison with the Bible, especially.
Are you religious when it comes to?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
So I just study religion out of interest.
Okay.
But for me, an area that I hope to work on next is Islamic liberation theology. So that's looking at how Islam encourages you to identify with the marginalized of society, particularly the impoverished, because of its emphasis on charity and kindness. So when I was reading it, that was a major thing that I took away, that emphasis on charity, kindness and tolerance. And you've got issues, like the so-called blasphemy laws in Pakistan. But if you read what the Quran says, when it comes to hearing insults about your religion, it says, just get up and don't sit with a person who's insulting your religion and then come back afterwards. So for me, the perception of Islam is very different to what it says in reality. And also, being in Pakistan as a Muslim country, it's, in some ways, I think it's made me a better person, to be honest, because of the emphasis on charity and hospitality. The way I've been treated by my colleagues here, it would never happen if they were in my shoes in the UK. So I've learned a lot from Muslims and Islam in a positive sense. So.
All right. I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please do subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you for the next podcast.